Like, if you go back to the sophistication of ancient Egypt and you think about what the civilization could have been like. I mean, you're just speculating. You're just trying to just imagine how they could have moved these 500-ton stone blocks 500 miles. You're putting all these things into your mind. And then say, how long does it take to get from that, if you knock back into barbarians, how long does it take to get from that to where we are now?
Well, evidence would suggest something like 6,000 years.
Which is wild.
It is.
You think about, like, but if you think about how absolutely fucking ruthless people were 2,000 years ago, doesn't it kind of make sense that those are the ones that made it through, and then it took a long time before they calmed the fuck down.
Right.
So if you go back to, you know, whatever it was, the sophistication level that people were at when they built ancient Egypt, let's just speculate that it was 20,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And you think about how much they had to endure to get to that point, and how much they had to. I mean, there's real evidence, and if you especially pay attention to the work of people like Steven Pinker, that over time there's been less violence, less crime, less everything. Like civilization has gotten better. We are calming down from now versus the way we were 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. Things are moving in the correct direction. But how long does it take before you have this level of sophistication that allows you to get to the pyramids? And then we're nowhere near that now. So even on the most conservative speculation that the Great Pyramid is only 4,500 years ago, we're not even anywhere near that now. We're nowhere near the level of sophistication that it took them to build. And we're just guessing as to what kind of technology they had available to them. And as you pointed out, with these vases and with just the alignment to the constellations, the sophistication that's involved in the construction to get stones that are tons of stone that you can't even get a razor blade in between. Like, what the fuck was going on?
Here's the fun thing to entertain is about moving the stone. So all that black granite that came from
500 miles away.
Yeah, but the ones that came from the eastern part of Egypt.
Oh, the Wadi Hammamet quarry that's in the east, in the mountains.
In the mountains of...
it's nowhere near the Nile.
Right, and so they would have had...
ground.
You'd have to go up and down mountains to move these things that were tens of tons, like off cliffs. And because like the narrative is like, oh, well, they would have brought these stones up the Nile.
Right.
Well, there's stones out there that are on the other side of the Nile in the mountains. So how did they bring those?
There's enormous stones.
Huge.
Enormous.
Well, there's 1,000-ton stones.
There's evidence. There's multiple statues that I can show you pictures of, that there were single-piece statues. So you have the unfinished obelisk in the quarry. That's 1,200 tons. But then you have at least 3 or 4 finished statues that were 1,000 tons, single-piece granite. And one of them's in a place called Tanis, which is way up in the north in the Delta. That's more than 1,000 miles from where that stone came from. And then moving that thing, I mean, it was around 1,000 tons finished, single-piece granite. So moving it, you may be at 1,500 tons or more, like moving that. There's a quarry in Egypt, I think it's called the Minya Quarry, which has these blocks. They're still attached, where they've cut these big blocks out, and there's like an image of what looks like a giant pharaoh that's been carved on top of it. They're made from limestone. Now, maybe they were never intended to be blocks, or maybe they were never intended to be finished, but if you assume they're blocks, these 2 blocks weigh, I think it's 3,500 and 5,000 tons a piece, based on the density of limestone in that region. Like, they're not disconnected, but that's the scale. We know there's objects up to like 1,200 tons, but the fact that they moved them 1,000 miles. And we have examples. There's a stone called the Russian Thunderstone. Have you heard of this?
No.
So like in the 1700s, they took a big lump of, I think it's granite or something like that, from Finland, and they shipped it to St. Petersburg, and they carved it into a statue. It's still there today. It's the Thunderstone. It's an edifice. It weighed... That's it now. Yeah, that's the finished one. This image here is the right one, yeah. So this is how they did it in the 1700s, the Thunderstone. And they moved it around 100, 150 meters a day. It took them forever. And the only way they did this was by basically sinking giant logs into the ground to give them a leverage point for these capstans. And they'd move a system of rails, big steel rails with steel ball bearings, behind it. It weighed about 1,500 tons. And just over a period of just very slow grinding and turning with capstans and pulleys and these steel tracks, they move at about 150 meters a day. It took them forever. And in order to get that thing across the water from Finland, they had to construct a giant barge, like a huge barge. And on each side of the barge, they would tie up 3 warships just to try and keep it stable. It's about the same size, same mass as the obelisk that's sitting in this mountainous quarry in Egypt, in Aswan. It's still in the ground. It's like 1,200 tons of granite. And you're expected to believe that they somehow were going to lift this thing up out of a quarry over these like basically big hills and mountains of granite and put it on a little ship that's narrowed in this, they call it the harbour there, and it's this tiny little space. I'm like, you're absolutely delusional if you think this was a simple task that could be achieved with primitive methods and then ship that thing 1,000 miles somewhere.
When you speculate, when you sit around by yourself, because you've thought about this a lot, how the fuck do you think they did this?
Look, I
take a wild
ass guess. I think there's connections possibly to gravity manipulation. I think anti-gravity had to play a part in moving some of this stuff. I actually think there's some connections to some of the work that's being done with this plasmoid implosion technology, the stuff that Randall's been looking into that's coming back to talk a little bit about. The relationship and the sacred geometry aspects of that are similar to the things that we see in some of these cultures in the past. So that may potentially have something to do with the methods that were used in the past. But I'm convinced it was a form of advanced technology. Now, whether it's our form of technology, because let's face it, we can do things like that today, but it takes hydraulics and diesel powers and cranes and all that stuff. They may have had an entirely different avenue of tech.